In discussing exponential growth and logistic growth, we introduced the idea of carrying capacity. And we know now that populations will continue to grow as long as resources are available. But as populations get larger, as they approach carrying capacity, resources start to decline. What we had listed in the previous recording and what we had been considering in terms of factors that influence population growth are what we now can more specifically refer to as density dependent factors. And the definition for this is essentially what the term sounds like. These are factors whose effect depends on the density of a population. So factors whose impact intensifies as a population gets larger. So predation and disease, those are both factors that become more intense as population size increases. Predators increase because there's a greater food supply. Disease increases because in a larger population, individuals are more likely to come into contact with each other. Competition is a density dependent factor. Competition increases as resources become overconsumed. So generally speaking, these density dependent factors are usually biotic, right? They're usually biological in nature. They're factors that are imposed by other species, whether those other species are competitors, diseases, or predators. So in the case of the Yellowstone wolves preying on elk, the denser an elk population is, the easier it is for wolves to find and take members of that population. So again, it's a factor that depends on the size of the population. But these are not the only factors that can influence population size. We also consider what's referred to as density independent factors. These are factors that impact the size of a population, but in a way that does not depend on or is not related to the size of the population. These tend to be abiotic factors as opposed to the generally biotic factors that density dependent factors are. So, no matter how big or small a population is, if there's a natural disaster, if there's a fire or a storm or a flood, if there are human impacts like pollution, those are going to impact individuals of that population regardless of their size. So if there's a fire, whether a individual, excuse me, if, say, an individual great horned owl living in that forest, whether or not that owl survives that fire is based on whether or not that owl can flee from the fire. It is independent of whether that owl is one of a population of 10 or one of a population of 100. So in other words, the chance of an individual dying has nothing to do with how many other individuals are in the area. So these are important factors. They exert really significant effects on population size, but we characterize them differently because their effect is independent of the size of the population. So a comprehensive consideration of population dynamics has to account for both density dependent factors and density independent factors and what they exert on population growth. Okay, now I want to put this all together into sort of a big picture way of summarizing some of the characteristics of species and populations. And to do this, I'm going to introduce this concept of life history traits. This is, very much kind of an intersection between ecology and concepts related to evolution. And we'll talk about evolution more formally in the next module. So I'll reference back to this when we do. The basic biology of a species influences a population's growth potential. If you recall, when I was first introduced exponential growth, I said growth is essentially determined by the biology of that species. All right. And so independent of all of those ecological factors we mentioned, how a population is potentially going to grow or shrink or whatnot is influenced by the biology of that of that species. So we refer to life history traits or life history strategies as any of the biological characteristics of a species that influence how quickly a population could potentially increase in number. So for example, populations or species vary in the age at which reproduction begins. So something like a rabbit reaches sexual maturity very early on in their lifespan. So they can begin reproducing earlier than mammals like humans, who have longer lifespans and a delayed kind of sexual maturity relative to some other smaller mammals. How often an organism reproduces throughout their lifetime, right? So again, strictly from a biological perspective, how long just a gestational period is, how much time individuals of a species take off between reproductive episodes. Taken together, that's going to influence over the course of a lifespan how many individuals, how many reproductive events an individual can have, even under ideal conditions, right? How many offspring are produced during each reproductive episode, right? Some organisms have very small clutch sizes, as we'd refer to them. So, 1 or 2 individuals being born per reproductive cycle. Others have hundreds or thousands. And so that's a biological factor that's going to influence over the course of an organism's lifespan how many offspring they can produce, all right? We can summarize different strategies as they relate to these sort of reproductive patterns as R-selected or K-selected strategies. And the R and the K refer to concepts we've already discussed. That R, you'll recall from the exponential growth model, references the growth rate or the biotic potential. And the K is the symbol we used for carrying capacity, okay? So our selected species are species that have a high biotic potential and generally have a shorter lifespan, early maturity, and high fecundity. So going back to these points here, they typically begin reproducing early on in their life cycle, they reproduce often, and they produce many offspring during each reproductive cycle. Like weedy plants, like the grasses shown here, insects, organisms that produce tons of offspring, but there is an investment in quantity over quality. So the probability of any one of those grass seeds surviving is relatively low. The probability of any one of these larvae successfully hatching is relatively low. Okay, in the Yellowstone example you've been following along with in your textbook, deer mice and plants like spotted knapweed are, weedy plants. There are selected plants. They're well adapted to changing conditions. They're able to exploit more unpredictable environments, and they can increase quickly through exponential growth if resources suddenly become available. They can sort of leverage those conditions, all right? So those are some of the patterns associated with organisms that exhibit this R-selected life history trait. As I mentioned here, these are sometimes also referred to as opportunistic species. K-selected species, sometimes known as equilibrium species, are species that tend to have longer lifespans. They're slower to mature. They mature later in their life cycle compared to R-selected species. They have fewer offspring per reproductive episode. They often take more time in between reproductive episodes. And they generally show patterns of logistic growth, right? One of the reasons their reproductive episodes are less frequent is because they invest more in parental care and in raising their offspring. So this is more of a quality over quantity type of approach to reproduction. So again, this coconut palm compared to this grass species. So even though that coconut is not producing as many fruits, as many seeds, each individual one has a higher probability of surviving because there's more resources invested in their offspring. Okay. And again, once again, the Yellowstone example, large mammals, bears, wolves, tends to be organisms that feed more at the top of the food chain, slower to grow, longer lived trees like spruce trees. They tend to be K-selected species. Again, longer lifespan, slower to mature, lower overall fecundity or birth rates. Okay. K-selected species cannot respond as quickly to a changing environment the way our selected species are. So they kind of decrease or increase slowly if resources show a gradual decrease or increase in availability. So females may have fewer offspring or reproduce less often if food resources are in shorter supply. And again, that goes back to the carrying capacity issue here. So that responsiveness to resource limitation tends to keep K-selected species, close to carrying capacity. Okay. In reality, this is a continuum. So not every organism, not every population can be like perfectly categorized as R selected or K selected. So in this continuum that's shown here, we're seeing some more of the traits that are associated with R selected or K selected species. Again, on the R selected side, short life, rapid growth, early maturity, lots of offspring, but they tend to be smaller, less parental care. Our selected species tend to be the prey, not the predators in an ecosystem. They tend to be adapted to unstable environments and are better able to take advantage of disturbances. So for example, our selected species would be some of the first species to come in after a fire. And they tend to be more generalists. We'll talk more about this concept. But, they're able to use a lot of different types of habitats, a lot of different types of resources. On the other end, again, K-selected, long life, slower growth, late maturity, quality over quantity. So they're producing fewer, but larger, higher quality offspring. That requires more investment in parental care. They tend to depend more on the stability of the environment. They're more sensitive to those environmental changes. They tend to be more specialists, so they have more specialized needs of their habitats and resources. And again, they tend to feed higher on the food chain. So they tend to be predators over prey. So large mammals, like I mentioned before, bears and elk, long-lived trees, are examples of K-selected species, and then weedy plants like dandelion, knapweed, small mammals, certain bird species fit on the R-selected end of the spectrum. But there are species that fit right in the middle. Again, it's not a perfect black or white categorization. If you think of California example, something like a giant sequoia on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. Giant sequoias are very slow to mature. They're huge organisms. They're very large organisms. They're very long life. So they're sort of the record holders in terms of some of these K-selected characteristics. But they produce tiny little cones. If you've ever seen a giant sequoia cone, it's not what you'd expect to see for such a large organism. And the seeds that those cones hold are teeny tiny, and each seed does not represent a whole lot of parental investment, right? The probability of one individual seed surviving of which giant sequoias produce many, many, is very low. So that aspect of little parental care, little parental investment, sort of quantity over quality, those are characteristics of a giant sequoia that are more R-selected, right? So again, it's important to consider that this is a continuum. Okay, I want to wrap up by just mentioning a couple other important aspects of forces or factors that influence population dynamics. And we're not really introducing, too many new fundamental concepts at this point, but we're sort of reframing how we have talked about some aspects of population dynamics. Ecologists are often interested in, again, putting this all together to sort of make some general or to recognize or describe kind of general patterns about how populations are shifting over time with respect to sizes. And again, the use of those models and the ability to think in this more general way helps with making predictions about how populations may respond to changes. So once again, to kind of bring the Yellowstone wolf example to an end, hopefully you've been following that story through with your notebook. But wolf populations grew pretty steadily following the reintroduction to Yosemite. But their reintroduction has had a lot of impacts on a variety of other populations in Yellowstone. I'm going to post a great video that illustrates this, and I encourage you to watch it. Wolves do not live alone in isolation. So they live in a community where their numbers are influencing the numbers of other populations to a great extent. So for example, in the many decades that wolves were absent from Yellowstone, elk populations crashed when food was not available. And that would often be due to drought, extreme winters, sort of abiotic burials, but also due to overgrazing. I'm going to go in opposite order here. So with a very high elk population, resources became overconsumed, okay? That's an example of what we refer to as bottom-up regulation. So we can characterize a population as being regulated by bottom-up factors if population sizes in a community are limited primarily by availability of resources that would otherwise support, growth and survival of organisms lower on the food chain. So, physical disturbances like fire, would free up nutrients and provide a boost for plant growth. That's a type of bottom-up regulation, all right? And for a lot of the kind of history of ecological study, there was an emphasis placed on bottom-up regulation, right? The assumption was that this was the regulating force at work on populations in an ecosystem. So for example, the regulation of lynx is determined by the availability of hares. That would be a bottom-up force if that were to be the primary factor. In more recent years, we've come to understand that predators play a really important role in determining population sizes. And a lot of the evidence for this has come from cases where we as humans have dramatically influenced predator populations. This is true of wolves, this is true of coyotes, this is true of sharks and marine ecosystems, right? We tend to systematically target and often attempt to exterminate large predators, mountain lions, right? And we've seen the impact that the reduction in the size of these predator populations has had, not just on their prey, but the entire ecosystem as a whole. And again, that's the video that I'm going to share on Canvas. That's what this regulates. So predators are playing a really important role in determining population sizes, not just in an incidental way. They're not just killing like the weak or sort of more vulnerable individuals that would otherwise die, right? They're exerting these significant effects that maintain essentially community structure and population structure. Okay, so going back to the wolf example, when wolves were reintroduced, the Yellowstone elk population had reached around 17,000. They were essentially overpopulated for that habitat by that point. With the reintroduction of wolves, their population steadily declined to around 5,000 approximately. And this had important implications for plant communities and a variety of other organisms in the ecosystem. The wolf kind of shifted control of the elk population to top-down regulation instead of bottom-up regulation, okay? Riparian habitats dominated by trees like aspens and willows were being controlled essentially from the top down by elk. So with a reduction in the population of elks, those aspens and willows were able to rebound. When elks were overpopulated, there was very low recruitment. There were very few saplings of things like aspens and willows in areas where elk were present. Okay, so more and more we understand the importance of top-down regulation. And I'm going to talk more about trophic linkages in the community ecology lecture. But when this dynamic is disrupted, we refer to that as a trophic cascade. So top-down effects from the presence or absence of a top predator that are felt all the way through a food chain, throughout an ecosystem, is referred to as a trophic cascade. So the removal of wolves ultimately impacting populations of aspens and willows, even though wolves don't eat aspens and willows, is an example of a trophic cascade. So that's, again, a concept or a phrase you'll hear me invoke in other contexts, and we'll be looking at a few more examples of that. Okay, so taken together, population size can be influenced by factors that decrease from the top down or kind of increase from the bottom up. But which of these has the greatest impact? Whether a population is primarily top-down regulated or primarily bottom-up regulated varies from population to population and from place to place. So you can think a bit more about that for the Yellowstone example, and your book has a nice example of both how top-down regulation and bottom-up regulation, plays out in a case study such as this one that you've been following along with.